गुलाबी मुखड़ी केवली छजीरे ना ककीन थुनी केवली छजीरे ना.
Hi, Raza. It's lovely to have you here. My name is Daleep Akoi, and I'm the owner of a lodge in Corbett called Jim's Jungle Retreat in honor of Jim Corbett. And it's truly wonderful to have you here with us. I was actually hoping that we'd be able to get to spend some time together in Nainital, but unfortunately, we are awash in rains, very unseasonal at this time of the year. But good to have you here all the same. Just a side note, I got to know about you after reading of your really interesting stories on Twitter. And it's been really wonderful to explore some of the topics that you brought out. And I think we'll have some time to talk about that as well. But first, let's get into the reason why we're here, and that is to talk about the legacy of Jim Corbett. He's a man that I grew up learning about, reading about, um, in the very place that he helped found, which is Corbett Tiger Reserve. And I know you had a similar history with the forests, spending a lot of your time with your father in the jungles, who awakened that love for the forest in you. Um, but before we go into that, the legacy of Jim Corbett, one of the most obvious ones is Corbett Tiger Reserve. There's several others, which I hope to explore with you. But if you can, just give me a sense of how did Corbett Tiger Reserve come about?
Thank you so much, Dalip, and you have been very kind with the introductions. I'm not sure if I deserve such high praise, but thank you nonetheless. And likewise, I wish we had met, in Nainital, but so that we get to meet soon. I'm really glad for this. This session is a very interesting topic, and Jim Corbett is such a larger than life figure, not just among what you'd call conservationists or wildlifers, but even people who have just lay interest in wildlife or the nature. They are more likely than not to have heard the name of Jim Corbett. In no less measure due to the tiger reserve that has been named after him. So I won't be going into the details of Jim Corbett's life as such and how many tigers he shot and all of those things, because they are there out there in the public domain, and a lot of people whosoever is interested can get to know more about them. But I want to talk about some of the lesser known aspects of Jim Corbett's work and contribution and his legacy. And Corbett Tiger Reserve, as you brought up, is a very important and interesting legacy of his, because we do know that, okay, Project Tiger started in 1973. Corbett Tiger Reserve was one of the original 9 tiger reserves. And before that, it was, the Corbett National Park, which was earlier known as the Ramganga National Park, before which it was known as the Haley National Park. But where does Jim Corbett figure in all of this is sort of a quite interesting story. So the story goes back to, let us start with, say, Jim's hunting career. Apart from hunting, man-eaters and tigers and leopards, he also used to sometimes organize, much to his displeasure, as he used to express with his friends, hunts for the governor of what was then the United Provinces, which is now divided between Uttar Pradesh and Uttarakhand. So during those hunts, as well as during his general jungle grooming, if I were to borrow the term of the South Indian, sometime known as Jim Corbett, Kenneth Anderson. So he had a lot of familiarity with this particular landscape that was around Dikala, Boxar, and all these this particular Patli Doon forest landscape. And because he used to organize hunts for the governor, as well as helping out the United Provinces government with dealing with these man-eaters, which had in some cases become major, it became major political issues. he was in the good books of at least the governor and some of the officers in that area. So then he in 1932, and this is at the fag end of his hunting career. But in 1932, he started what was known as the he realized the importance of the dwindling fauna of that area, and which was something that he had witnessed during his lifetime. And he got together with a bunch of like-minded people and started what was known as the Association for the Preservation of Game in United Provinces. This was in 1932. One of the, if you go through the objects of resolution of this association, one of the objects was to create a national park in United Provinces. And it was around this time that a conference for the preservation of fauna happened in London in, I think, 1933, if I'm not mistaken. And in these critical years between 1932 35, all these definitions for what a national park would be, what would it entail, what would be a protected sanctuary, all these terms that we are so familiar with today, the sort of the seeds of these terms and how to define them and what they would entail was laid around this time. So in 1932, in 33, when this conference has happened in London, after that, Jim Corbett, along with two other important members, one is Mr. Hassan Abid Jafri, who was the secretary to the Raja of Mahmudabad. Mahmudabad is a famous estate close to Lucknow. And he was secretary there, and he was very interested in wildlife, and especially on conservation. He himself was not a hunter. And then there was another gentleman who joined later on, Mr. R.C. Morris, who was a tea planter based in Western Ghats, Nilgiris to be precise. And he has written quite a bit in Journal of Bombay Natural Society. He was a first-rate naturalist if you go through his old articles. But mainly it was Jafri Saab and Corbett who got together, and they started petitioning the government, especially through the governor and then right up to the central government, to get this particular stretch of forest in Kumaon, which we better now known as Corbett National Park, the core of that area that is around Dekala, this Patli Doon area. A lot of it, unfortunately, has gone in the Kalagad Reservoir. But in those days, they wanted to get this area protected to start with and create it as the first national park in India. So this lobbying keeps on going from 1933 onwards, and then in 1935, something very remarkable happens. The Association for Preservation of Game in United Provinces, under their sponsorship and their sort of what you'd call, pressing all the princely states of the time as well as the British province of the time to get together and work for the preservation of wildlife and do some things, at least have some basic policy understanding on it, on the lines of what had been done in London in 1933. They organized in the month of January of 1935 what was known as the All India Conference for the Preservation of Wildlife. And here, every state, British province in India, and every, almost every major princely state of India were represented in that conference. They all got together, discussed what was to be done. And for United Provinces, it was, among other people, two names that a lot of people will be familiar with. Jim Corbett, obviously, he was there as the representative of the Association for Preservation of Game of UP, United Provinces, and there was a FW champion who was representing the Forest Department. And then, obviously, there was Mr. F. Canning, who was the chief conservator of at the time, a very remarkable forest officer, and he was also representing, I think, the Tehri state. So all these people get together, and then they sort of brainstorm over 3 days on what to do regarding preservation of wildlife. There are lots of different viewpoints that are presented. Some states and some princely states are not in favor of putting any restrictions on hunting. Some are in favor, but it's a very interesting meeting that goes on. And if you go through the proceedings of that meeting, you can find what Corbett has all said, and they're very what you'd call visionary statements that he gives at the meeting. I'll not go into details, but to cut to the chase, that after the conference, what happens is that eventually the United Provinces government is convinced to pass a bill which would later turn into the United Provinces National Parks Act. So this happens in 1935, immediately in the aftermath of the conference, and with that, the first national park that is notified under this, this bill that Corbett has worked so hard to push through, along with Hassan Abid Jafri and others. It results in the creation of what is known as the Haley National Park. And the demarcation of what would be the national park area, it was, I think, I might be missing, but it was 125 square kilometers or 100 square kilometers, something around that. So they demarcate that area through field visits and through extensive discussions between Corbett, F.W. Champion, and two other forest officers, E.A. Smithies, and F. Canning also puts in his word. So these four major pillars, but Corbett was the one who knew that area in and out. So his inputs were the most important, so to speak. And then that is how the national park is created. And then, as we know, Haley National Park was, it was named after Sir Malcolm Haley, who was a governor at the time and a great supporter of conservation in United Provinces, especially because of Jim Corbett and his friendship that he had with Mr. Haley. And after that, as we know, in independence happens, the name is changed to Ramganga National Park. Then Corbett dies in 1955, and the name is, the national park is again renamed in his honor as Corbett National Park, and that forms the core of what becomes the Corbett Tiger Reserve in '73. That is how the entire story.
Wow, that's fascinating. Because those details one doesn't really get to encounter. And I'm actually glad that this happened, because when Project Tiger was launched, my parents had just gotten married, and right after their marriage, they'd gone to visit Corbett, and Project Tiger was getting launched, and they had no place to stay, so they managed to find a tent in Vikala, and then there was a very sweet gentleman by the name of Mr. Meghi, whose brother was also the field director later on, who said, "There's no way you guys are spending the night on your honeymoon in a tent." So he gave them his cabin. And my father's association with Corbett has been striking because of a legacy that not only Corbett shared, but also others during his time who were contemporaries of Corbett who used to hunt, and also then realized the importance of conservation when they saw the dwindling numbers of wildlife. And I think Corbett writes a lot about this as well. And which brings me to the other point of his legacy, which is his writings. He wrote extensively about his observations of wildlife, of the ecosystems that he encountered. And if you allow me, I'd like to just read a short passage from one of his stories. And he says, "I have used the word absorbed in preference to learnt, for jungle law is not a science that can be learnt from textbooks. It can, however, be absorbed a little at a time, and the absorption process can go on indefinitely. For the book of nature has no beginning, as it has no end. Open the book where you will, and at any period of your life. And if you have the desire to acquire knowledge, you will find it of immense interest. And no matter how long or how intently you study the pages, your interest will not flag. For in nature, there is no finality." So tell me, Raza, when was the first time you encountered any of his writings, and what impact did it have on you?
So you've read out one of my most, one of the most favorite passages of mine from his works, and I think I encountered his work when I was maybe 7 or 8 years. I remember there was a green paperback version of Jungle Lore that used to be kept in my father's Almirah, and I vividly remember it had a photo of a tiger on the illustration of, and I found it as a kid. I found it very fascinating. Jungle Lore and this tiger and Jim Corbett made on it, and I mean, back 7, 8 years, I was hardly very good at reading, but I nonetheless flipped through the pages, would ask my father about it. And so that is how I got introduced to Corbett. Of course, in the coming years, I would read, all his books. But yeah, that was my first encounter. And this is what I wanted to talk about as well, that there have been countless books written on shikar and wildlife, especially in that era of, say, between 1870 to 1950. That was sort of what I call the golden era of shikar literature, because there was tons of work being produced on hunting in India. But the fact that why Jim Corbett's books have endured, and his writing sort of relates, and it resonates with so many people. What, he's been dead for about 55 and going to 77 years now. It's because, and his first book came out in 44, so it's been a huge time span that has gone by. And yet his writing, the magic of his writing endures, is because it touches the chord of the reader in sort of the, I think, and this, I speak for myself, and I think for a lot of my friends who I know have read Corbett at an impressionable age, or even later for that matter, is that when you read his books, the first instinct is that you it's not about the hunting of the animal that is at the forefront. It's more about life in that area, forest of that area, how Corbett perceives the forest, the people, how it describes the landscape, the traditions, the culture of that area, what being in a forest feels like, and all these things. And hunting is sort of incidental to it. It's not the be all and end all of his works, and that is what I think stays with the reader. So when you read his books, your first instinct or your first sort of desire after finishing the pages is that, oh, I wish I could go to a forest, nearby forest. Oh, I wish I could go walk a forest and observe the forest the way he does. And that, I think, is the laying of the seed of conservation, nature love, whatever you would like to call it, in any human being. First and foremost, you have to have that desire to be in the forest, to look, to observe the beauty of the forest, the ways of the forest, the people, the life of those landscapes. And it is only then that you have the desire, then you want to go to that landscape or to the nearest forest of your area. And then sort of it becomes a addictive affair, and you get into it. And then once you start falling in love with that forest, as it is, whenever you are in love with anything, you want to protect it. And so then conservation becomes the next natural step. So I think that is where Corbett stands out. And I think that is the biggest legacy of his writing, or his biggest literary legacy, I would say, is introducing so many people. I mean, there must be hundreds of thousands in the last 80 years to nature, to forest, and turning them into conservationists or nature lovers or writers themselves, just being associated with the forest. So I think that is his biggest contribution, much more than the animals, the man-eaters that he hunted, and so on and so forth.
True. And I think his observations were really astute and timely, and also, setting aside some of the misconceptions one has about the forests and the carnivores that exist. In his Man-Eaters of Kumaon, in his author's note, he's talking about man-eating tigers and leopards and how they become man-eaters. And I just want to read this short paragraph out, and then I'll ask you the question. The author who first used the words as cruel as a tiger and as bloodthirsty as a tiger when attempting to emphasize the evil character of the villain of his piece not only showed a lamentable ignorance of the animal he defamed, but coined phrases which have come into universal circulation and which are mainly responsible for the wrong opinion of the tigers, held by all except a very small proportion of the public who have the opportunity of forming their own opinions. And he goes on to say, when I see the expression as cruel as a tiger and as bloodthirsty as a tiger in print, I think of a small boy armed with an old muzzle loading gun, the right barrel of which was split for 6 inches of its length, and the stock and barrels of which were kept from falling apart by lashings of brass wire, wandering through the jungles of the Terai and Bhabur in the days when there were 10 tigers to every one that now survives. And this is talking in 1940s. Sleeping anywhere he happened to be when night came on, with a small fire to give him company and warmth, weakened at intervals by the calling of tigers, sometimes in the distance, at other times near at hand, throwing another stick on the fire and turning over and continuing his interrupted sleep without one thought of unease, knowing from his short experience and from what others who, like himself, had spent their days in the jungles had told him, that a tiger, unless molested, would do him no harm. And then he goes on to say, there is, however, one point on which I'm convinced that all sportsmen, no matter what their viewpoint has been, a platform on a tree, the back of an elephant, or on their own feet, will all agree with me, and that is that a tiger is a large-hearted gentleman with boundless courage, and that when he is exterminated, as exterminated he will be, unless public opinion rallies to his support, India will be the poorer, having lost the finest of her fauna. I mean, what brilliant words, huh? It just gives me goosebumps each time I read it, and helps really makes one understand, you know, there is really no fear from a tiger if you just leave it, you know, where it is supposed to exist. Tell me, your time in the jungles, what have your observations been that that we probably don't even know about?
So I think, I can't claim to have experienced the forest as intimately as Corbett did, walking for days at end and, sleeping wherever he fancied on the forest floor. But I do remember that. So my formative years were in the forest of Palamu, that lies in western Jharkhand. Like Corbett Tiger Reserve, it was one of the first 9 tiger reserves of India in 1973. And unfortunately, in our area, as things would pan out, wildlife has had a precipitous decline in the far past couple of decades. But when I was growing up, it was still around, and I think one of my earliest memories is if I remember correctly, it basically was that I was walking this forest with my father I was accompanying my father to douse a forest fire, which was a rather interesting way to get introduced to a forest. And this was, I must be barely 4 or 5 years old. And I was pestering my father. He was going out to get the fire under control, and I was sort of harassing him. And then he just was like, chuck this boy into the jeep as well. And so I was taken to the forest, and I apparently tried doing some of my, taking some jhadi and, trying to blow out the already blowed out forest fire. And then I remember, maybe I think Corbett would appreciate of this or not, maybe, that I tried making a what is called a chua here. So it is basically that you when you go when you're thirsty and you want some water, and it's summers, so all the nalas are dry. So then you go and basically dig a sort of a saucer shaped structure in the sand, and more often than not, you will get some water percolating from the ground to drink from. And this is something that is used both by animals and all the local communities, especially the Adivasis here. I picked up that from them, and I quickly I was thirsty and I gulped down some water, and then I think that the water was no good because it was next to a very stagnant pool, and I had the worst runs, and my mother was quite angry at my father. But then all of those, I'm pretty sure Corbett has made some chuas in his lifetime and drunk from them as well. So I think that is the only thing that I can claim to get close to and relate to in terms of our jungle visits. But yeah, that is it. And the fact that you talked about public opinion, that reminds me that is very important, because the organization that I told you about in 1932, the Association for Preservation of Game in United Provinces, one of these primary objects was to rally public opinion to get people to care about wildlife, especially not just the bureaucracy or the the who's who of the British government, but the lay people. Because Corbett, and they write in their manifesto, so to speak, that until and unless the general public at large in India starts caring about wildlife and forests, these charismatic animals will eventually die out. And so that is how I think how it all ties up, all my experiences and the fact that about public opinion that you talked about.
Wow. I'm afraid we don't have that much time left, but I just wanted to sort of end on this note. There have been many far-reaching consequences of the legacy of Corbett, his writings, his work. In fact, two I can say right now. It's you and I. We are also the legacy of Corbett. You pursue your love today of the jungles because you were introduced to those forests with your father, with the backdrop of Corbett's writings and all that he had done to preserve and spark the movement of conservation in India. And I stand here or sit here in front of you in a forest that we've created in Corbett Tiger Reserve, which we call the Mahavan Project. And we invite our guests to come and experience a forest with all the intricacies of an ecosystem, and hope that they go away thinking about the jungle like we do, and love it and want to come back to preserve it. So thank you so much, Raza. It has been a pleasure speaking with you. I do hope that we can do this again.
Yes, I hope so too. I hope so too.